Welcome to the Classical Mind, a podcast about the great books in the Western canon. We're your hosts. I'm Father Wesley Walker.
And I'm Dr. Junius Johnson.
Junius, how are you doing?
I'm good. It's been so long since we got to record. It's good to see you again.
That's right. This is one of the weird days in which we are, or one of the weird weeks in which we're recording two episodes in the same week, which is exciting and fun. It's especially kind of disconcerting because we didn't record for a while just due to scheduling constraints, and then all of a sudden here we are twice in the same week. But I love it, and we get to talk about some really good books this week. Today we are talking about the Proslogion by Saint Anselm of Canterbury. Junius, what is your experience with this text?
I don't think I encountered this text until I was in divinity school. Um, yeah, I think I read it then for the first time in sort of a medieval theology survey course. Um, but I think I at least heard about the argument before that, so it wasn't my first time hearing about the argument. Um, and it's my first response to the text was I think an experience a lot of people have with the ontological argument, which is a feeling like someone has just pulled a fast one on you. I get that feeling from Socrates sometimes too, where he makes you agree to something, and you're like, yeah, I don't see how I couldn't agree with that, but something must have gone wrong somewhere because I don't think that's right, you know. And so that was in the trying to figure out, all right, what's really going on here, and that becomes a pretty deep rabbit hole to go down as you ask what you think are very simple questions, and they turn out not to be so simple after all. How about you?
Yeah. I first experienced Anselm and the ontological argument in an undergrad philosophy course, which was really a kind of apologetics type class, is what it ended
Mm,
up being. And when it was first explained to me, I did not like it much. I then experienced Anselm further when I was doing some research on atonement theology, and I had been looking into some Eastern Orthodox material, and there was a lot of really negative things to say about Anselm, as if he's kind of just a reiteration of Calvin or a sort of penal substitutionary atonement. Um, and so for quite a while, I had a negative kind of reaction to Anselm, not because I had really read him, but because I had read people who didn't like him.
mm,
And then I actually, for some reason, picked up the text of Anselm, and read Proslogion and Curdeus Homo, his other work, and realized that Anselm is much deeper and much more beautiful than I had originally thought he would be based on the criticisms of him that I had read. I think the high point of my experience with Anselm was I took a class with Dr. Hans Boersma at Nashotah House, and there was an Episcopalian in the class, older gentleman. He was just auditing, I think. But the day before we discussed Anselm in class, he was complaining about it. Oh, I
mm.
can't believe we're reading Anselm. This is terrible, blah, 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 blah. And I was like, no, 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 you have to read Anselm. He's really, really good. And so I said, if I lend you my copy, will you read it tonight and bring it back to class tomorrow? And he was like, yeah, 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 sure, I'll do it. So he did. And then he came back the next day and was like super excited that we were reading Anselm because he actually read it and enjoyed it. So I feel like that was a good achievement. But
Nice.
I've read a lot of Anselm at this point. I mean, I've read this text, I've read Curdeus Homo multiple times. His prayers are amazing. He's got some
Hmm.
really beautiful prayers. He's got a great treatise on the Blessed Virgin Mary that is quite good, and on the sort of virginal conception and all that. So I really am a big fan of Anselm. In fact, somewhere in my office, I don't know where since we moved, but I have a little art piece of him that
Nice.
was done, and so yeah, I'm a big Anselm fan at this point in life. I think he was really quite brilliant,
Hmm.
and someone that warrants a lot of study. I find that period of kind of early scholasticism to be exciting too. I think it's not maybe as rigid as later scholasticism gets.
Hmm.
There's kind of a spirit of inquiry and discussion, and there's not really a fear of maybe different ways of explaining things that they end up usually agreeing with each other. They just, kind of have multifaceted ways of getting there. And
Hmm.
so, anyways, I really appreciate all of that and think Anselm is one of the great, maybe underrated theologians of the church.
Yeah, I have I've taught Curdeus Homo as a standard. I think it's one of the most important works ever written about Christian atonement in the West. And it doesn't matter whether you agree with it or not. It's been incredibly influential, and it's really, really good. And it's a really great example of how to argue well theologically.
Hmm.
And so I've taught it a lot. In in a variety of settings, and I really love teaching it. And I agree with you. Anselm is one of the great theologians of the Middle Ages, just a delightful thinker, and he's got a wonderful mixture of philosophical acumen and spiritual fervor that comes across in his writings. And so it's a name that I don't know if I say that he's not exactly overlooked, right? I mean, you see the name a lot, and people name schools after him and things like that. But he may be overlooked in the sense that we're probably not reading him as much as we should be. And so, yeah, it is exciting to get people to read more. And we're doing the Proslogion because that's, one of the works that it's the work that's most likely to be on your syllabus or to come across your desk or whatever else. And it is a cool and important work, but it's not the most important Anselm to read. I mean, in many ways, the Monologion is even more enjoyable and delightful to read. And then, of course, the Crudes Homo is so, so important. So hopefully by the end of this episode, we will have been able to convince you to pick up your Anselm and read more of him because he's really got a lot of very good things to say. And he was one of the giants to people like Thomas Aquinas and Bonaventure.
Hmm. Yes, yes, yes. So totally lege.
Yeah.
Um, in fact, I should say, I believe, Junius, my first ever interaction with you was not really a personal one, but rather I think I read your book, Patristic and Medieval Atonement Theory,
Mm,
is the first way that I like came in to know who you were. And
yeah.
so, yeah, so it's
That's
fun
fun. That
how
was a
that all
fun book.
converges. Yeah.
That was a fun book.
Well, I thought maybe what we could do is talk a little bit about the background of Saint Anselm before we get into the actual text itself, because he is one of those people, like, even if you kind of are familiar with the ontological argument and you maybe are a little bit aware of some of his writings, his biography is a very interesting one, very tumultuous, which is interesting because this is a monk. Well, at least for a chunk of his career, he was a monk, a practicing monk. And then he writes this beautiful theology. And when you hear his biography, it's kind of like, how did this guy ever have time to write this stuff? He was born in 1033 in Italy. He was raised during a period of political upheaval, and so it seems like his family was dispossessed of their land as a result
Mhm.
of some of that upheaval. As a young man, he did feel the call to monastic life, like when he was like 15 or 16, but his dad and the local abbot rejected him. And so after this, he got sick, though there's some disagreement among scholars as to whether this was a real illness or something that was maybe more psychological because of the rejection that he received. But when he got better, he kind of didn't do a whole lot in by way of religion for a while. He kind of decided to live a carefree life. His mom died when he was a young man, and probably giving birth to his sister, which caused his father to find religion. But it seems like a lot of fathers who do this end up becoming really severe, like Soren Kierkegaard, E.B. Pusey, both of their dads kind of do this, and it kind of rubs the son the wrong way.
Mhm.
So the dad ends up going to the monastery, and Anselm decides to go wander around Europe for a while. He goes backpacking across Europe and ends up in France and Burgundy and stuff. When his dad died is when Anselm then joins a monastery at Bec. And after only 3 years there, he's made the prior. After about 15 years, he becomes the abbot. One of his big mentors becomes the Archbishop of Canterbury, so he starts going over to England a little more often to visit. And they like him over there, and so William the First, the King of England at the time, names Anselm the successor to his mentor as the Archbishop of Canterbury. But then the Archbishop dies, and William the First dies, and William the Second, the son, decides he's not going to recognize any successors named by his father.
Mhm.
And in fact says, I'm not even going to appoint an Archbishop of Canterbury, which is kind of a controversial thing to do. This is wrapped up in a whole thing called the investiture controversy, and there are questions about who makes a bishop or who decides who gets to be bishops, and different countries and different areas kind of had different arrangements with the Pope about how to do this, and so it was a whole controversy. But William the First not only decides he's not going to appoint anybody as the successor to the Archbishop of Canterbury, he says especially not Anselm. He in fact even pledges by the holy face of Luca that there would be no Archbishop of Canterbury, especially Anselm. And that worked for about 4 months until William II got sick and he thought he was going to die. So he calls Anselm, and Anselm gives him, here's his confession, and gives him unction and last rites, and so William II appoints him as the Archbishop of Canterbury as like an act of contrition. Anselm tries to resist, but he can't completely, and so finally he consents to be the Archbishop. But Anselm becomes a flashpoint in a long history of tension between the English monarchy and the papacy. Anselm and the papacy wanted the church to be its own authority. The church should be governed by the church, whereas William II wanted to be king over both the state and the church, um, which is really then one of the causes of the English Reformation, hundreds of years later, that that Henry wanted to have control over not just the state but also the church. So during this time period, the king actually goes so far as to say of Anselm, I hated him before, I hate him now, and I shall hate him still more hereafter. So relations were not great. In fact, the King of England orders the other bishops in England not to treat Anselm as the primate. And interestingly, the bishops in England support the king. The nobles in England support Anselm, which is kind of the inverse of how you would think
Yeah.
things would be. But that's how the die was cast. Eventually, Anselm gets exiled. The king says, you're not allowed to come back. So he goes to Lyon in France. He tried to resign his office, but instead the Pope actually refused the resignation and then makes him the defender of the Western position on the Filioque and on using unleavened bread and the Eucharist against the Eastern Church. So for a while, Anselm goes and does some, I guess it's not really ecumenism, it's sort of the opposite of that, but polemicism, I guess, against the East. When William dies, his brother Henry takes over, and Henry kind of makes peace with Anselm, allows him to return. Um, the condition is Anselm has to be invested again, sort of by Henry. And Henry also had a lover named Matilda, and there was some question, I guess, about whether she had actually been a nun before, and if she was, she wasn't eligible to be his wife, and so there was this whole thing. But Anselm sort of finds out she wasn't ever actually a nun, so he goes to the Pope to get a dispensation for Henry to marry her. And while he's there, the Pope decides to basically excommunicate him or bar him from office because he received the investure from the king, which the Pope didn't want. And so Anselm just can't please anybody. He's kind of stuck in the middle of these two forces of nature. Eventually, of course, the situation's resolved, and Anselm's allowed to go back to England. So he's exiled twice as the Archbishop of Canterbury. But despite that really tumultuous career, Anselm had an impressive a bibliography. He was an amazing theologian. He's often called the father of scholasticism. He was very influenced by the Neoplatonism of St. Augustine and Pseudo Dionysius. He's also very influenced by Boethius. And so there's a lot there in terms of what we've talked about in the past of this show that kind of comes to bear on who Anselm was. And so he, in many ways, continues a lot of the traditions that we've already began to discuss. So just a fascinating guy. Did I leave anything out,
But
Junius?
the only thing I would add to that is that it's important to keep in mind that the Norman conquest happened in the
Right.
middle of Anselm's life, and so he was a vassal of William when William was William II, Duke of Normandy. And so once William conquered England, became William the First of England. Anselm remained his vassal, and part of the reasons for him going to England, yes, to visit Lanfranc, who had been his abbot and friend and mentor, and had then become Archbishop of Canterbury, but also to do homage to his lord and his new title as King of England. And so some of this being exiled, it's okay, so you're leaving the England parts and going to the Norman parts, and then sometimes you have to leave the Norman parts too. And there was all of just it's a snapshot of how tumultuous all of the affairs of that time were. And you mentioned the investiture controversy when the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope are having an outright battle over who gets to do what, and the Pope excommunicates the Holy Roman Emperor, and the Holy Roman Emperor denies that he's Pope, and all these other sorts of things go on. So it's a really politically intense time that Anselm's living through, and all of these major things are happening in the background of him trying to carry out his ministry and do his work.
I think that's one thing about his bio that's really a good reminder, which is that no matter which period you live in, when it comes to church affairs, there's always some political dimensions of that that feels unseemly and a little bit gross, maybe.
Hmm.
And it's true; those things are, and you know, they're it's not always good the things we have to put up with in the church, but. That doesn't necessarily mean that stuff is a barrier to doing good theology, to thinking deeply about some really important questions, and living a beautiful life filled with devotion. Because
Yeah.
Anselm certainly is able to do all that in the midst of being exiled and having these arguments with kings and popes and all that. So just because you see sometimes how the sausage is made doesn't mean that you have to become a total vegetarian, you know.
That's right.
Um, so the work we're discussing is called the Proslogion, and it is in some ways a sequel, right? There is a work that precedes it, and these are both written, I believe, when he's still in the monastery before he becomes the Archbishop of Canterbury. The Monologion was written first, and according to Anselm, that is an example of meditation on the meaning of faith from the point of view of one seeking, through
Hmm.
silent reasoning within himself, things he knows not. And
Hmm.
so the Monologion is a series of arguments, kind of made to convince someone or to convince oneself, of the truth,
Hmm.
of God's existence and who God is and all these things. In the prologue or the preface of Proslogion, he says as he's doing that work, he begins to desire or to look for a proof that requires no other proofs, um, a syllogism that doesn't require other syllogisms, you know. Um, and that would really kind of be the knockout, drag out, like God really exists. He's the supreme good, you know, we don't need anything else. Um, and what's interesting to me, and I think this has a lot of bearing on how we should read the Proslogion, is that Anselm says the more he thinks about this argument, coming up with this argument, the harder it is for him to come up with it. It's only when he kind of lets go or when he
Hmm.
puts it aside that he's actually able to make progress on the argument, which is what he will do, this ontological argument that we've been talking about, and we'll explain what that means here in a minute. But I think that's a really important moment in the treatise when he admits that it's the setting aside of the argument that then it comes to him rather than something he is able to sort of dig up on his own,
Hmm.
through a lot of effort.
Hmm. Yeah. Right at the beginning, I mean, one of the questions that attaches to this text as a result of the long tradition of it having been discussed by both philosophers and theologians is what type of thing does he think he's writing anyway, right?
Right.
And um, some people like Karl Barth, for example, argue that it's not meant to be a logical proof of the existence of God. It's a prayer. Um, and others say no, like it's a proof. He's trying to write a proof, and that's what he seems to say in the English edition. We're working from the major works of Canada of Anselm, by the way. This is the Oxford World Classics volume, which is a volume I'd recommend everyone pick up because it
Hmm.
gets you, most of Anselm in a handy volume. But in the preface, he says that what he was looking for was he says, I began to wonder if perhaps it might be possible to find one single argument that for its proof required no other save itself, and that by itself would suffice to prove that God really exists, that he is the supreme good, needing no other, and is he whom all things have need of for their being and well-being. Um, the word, argument in Latin is one of the things that is at issue here. The translation of proof is interpretive. It can mean proof. It also just means evidence of any sort. Um, Not that which proves something, but that which suggests something may be true, right? In the same way that I found evidence that the letter may have been tampered with. It doesn't prove that the letter had been tampered with. You've got to look at the whole situation together to see how it fits in. So does he mean argumentum in that sense, or does he mean argumentum in the strong sense of a logical demonstration? And then the word that he says about would need no other proof. In Latin, he uses a form of the verb probare, which is where we get our English word proof. But what probare really means is to test something,
Mm.
to question it, to see if it holds up. It doesn't necessarily mean prove in the strongest sense that we mean in English today, proves beyond the shadow of a doubt, that sort of a thing. But both of these words contain that strong sense as well. So you can't look at the Latin words and say, well, he wasn't trying to do a proof. That's not what these words mean. No, they can mean that. But you also can't look at the Latin and say, well, he was trying to do a proof, and that's what the Latin. Yeah, they don't have to mean that either. They can mean something else. So the Latin words are unclear as to what he's doing. And so you'd have to look at the whole thing. It does seem to me, as I turn this question over in my mind, that's funny. That's an Anselmian locution that just stuck into my head because I've been reading him and talking about it, thinking about him. But it seems to me that I think he thinks he's doing more than just giving you a reason why it's not illogical to think that God exists. I think yes, it is a prayer, but I think it's within the prayer. I do think he has found a strong evidence for the existence of God. He seems to think that this is a fairly unassailable evidence. He even says at one point that even if I didn't believe, this would still have to compel me to believe. So I don't feel like I can go all the way with those who say, no, 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 it's not a logical proof. He's not trying to prove the existence of God. Um, I think he kind of thinks that he is, but at the same time, I can't go all the way with those who say, look, it's meant to be, he's setting out to build a logical demonstration, um, and that's the main purpose, is to write a philosophical argument that proves the existence of God. Because when he goes to say that he was forced to sort of give them a title, right? He says, if I, the first title he gave to this work was Faith Seeking Understanding,
Mm.
right? Which is the thing he's most famous for saying, which he learned from Augustine. And then after that, he decided to call it proslogion, allocution, speaking to someone. But if what this work really is title wise, and it's a title he wrote after the fact to describe what he thought he was doing in it, what he thought would help the reader, if what it really is faith seeking understanding, then it's not the type of logical demonstration that aims to convert one who doesn't believe into belief. It's rather a logical demonstration that aims to show to one who believes why he is absolutely right to believe. And so that's a fairly strong sort of demonstration. But if you were to say, well, I mean, look, as I will argue as this episode goes on, there are a lot of good reasons not to be convinced by this argument if you don't already believe in God. Then I think Anselm would say, well, yeah, I can see that. That's fine. You're a fool, but that's not really whom I'm addressing anyway.
Yeah. I think in some ways that distinction between philosophy and theology that is brought to bear heavily on the text, um, or maybe we'd say reason and faith, or however you want to frame it, is in Anselm's mind maybe somewhat of a false dichotomy. I mean, I don't think he's distinguishing those two things in the same way that a modern person would. And so it feels like a kind of uniquely modern hermeneutic to do that. It's certainly true that I also don't like when I first heard the argument, I was like, this can't possibly be a serious argument for God. Um, and it's not one I would break out with a non-Christian.
Mhm.
I would not first start there, except the only kind of utility that I think it would have, at least in terms of debating with a modern atheist or something, would be that can establish a definition for what we're talking about when we talk about God.
Yeah.
On the foundation of that definition, then I think Anselm really can foster a kind of mystical encounter with this being other than which nothing greater can be conceived. So there is kind of a both and there in terms of both rationality, but also a kind of faith
Hmm.
that is it's hard to fully express in words, but both are present there, I think, for
Hmm.
Anselm in a really strong way.
Yeah. Augustine's version of faith-seeking understanding is unless I believe, I won't know.
Hmm.
And that's a good way to, Anselm starts from Lord, I believe, help thou my unbelief, right? The belief is there to help me to understand the reasons of what I believe. But I think it's helpful to put it back in the context of where he learned it from, to say that, yes, and the reason why I start off believing and then seek the reasons for the belief is that if I don't start with belief, I'll never reason myself to belief. There are some things, the way this comes out a couple of centuries later in somebody like Bonaventure is the statement that, while it's true in a trivial sense that you can't love what you don't know because you have to be aware of something in order to love it. In the more profound sense, you can't know something unless you love it because you can't really see it well and spend the time with it that's required to truly understand it unless you have that commitment of love in place already. And that's the authentic Augustinian approach that both Anselm and Bonaventure are being influenced by and are trying to hold themselves to. So there is a real sense of in which it's a different project to go from not believing to knowing than to go from believing to knowing. And it may be unsurprising if this text doesn't serve both of those projects perfectly,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Um, but for my money, as we'll see when we get into the weeds of it a little bit more, the challenges one could lay to this argument don't have primarily to do with whether you believe or not, but rather have primarily to do with your fundamental metaphysical commitments.
Hmm. So the argument itself,
Yeah.
like I said, it kind of relies on a definition, right? God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived.
Hmm.
So there is a kind of logical move in Anselm's argument, which is that even the fool who says there's no God has something in their mind that they mean when they say the term God.
Hmm.
If God exists only in the mind, then we can always conceive of a greater being, one who actually would exist, because it's better to
Hmm.
exist than not to exist outside the mind. And so therefore, then the conclusion is God must exist in reality because it's greater to exist in reality than just in the thought of a creature, basically.
Yeah, that's right.
Um, and so then his point is that God's non-existence is really impossible if God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. He
Hmm.
has to necessarily exist. Um,
Yeah. And maybe one way to help kind of motivate the sense of this, one of the things that when my daughter started going to school, her well-meaning teacher said to her at some point that unicorns aren't real. And she came home and told me that her teacher had said that unicorns aren't real. And I said, well, I think that's an interesting question. Depends very much on what you mean by real. Um, if what she means is, as far as we can tell, it's unlikely that you're ever going to encounter a unicorn physically in the world that we live in, that's probably true. I can't say that it's absolutely true. We haven't encountered 85% of the species on the planet, but based on what we've seen so far, that's probably true. But it doesn't follow from that that they aren't real. Some of the most powerful things in human experience are not able to be encountered in the world as we know it. The idea of justice, right? Things like this. And so let's make a distinction about what we mean by real. Um, she she internalized this and she began to ask me questions like, Daddy, are bears real in our world? Because what she wanted to know was, of all the things I need to be afraid of running into, are bears among them, or are they more like dragons, where I'm probably good, assuming the dragons aren't an existential threat, right? And so she was trying to parse these different levels of reality, because she intuited that to be real in my mind versus to be real in the world out there, that's a big difference, right? And there's this sense in which you want to say, well, a world in which we don't just have the idea of unicorns, but in which unicorns are actually running around, frolicking all over the place, is a better world. And so if you had to ask me to choose, would I rather have unicorns be real in thought or real in existence, real in things? I'd rather have them be real in things because then I can see one and I can ride on one and I can talk to one or whatever the case may be, right? Kill them and use their horns for magical powers. Um, and that's kind of the idea Anselm's working with here is that yeah, you can talk about God existing in thought, but it would be better if we're talking about the best possible being, a being so good that not only could there not be a better being, but it would be impossible to even imagine a better being, then it would be better for that being to exist than not to exist, because if it didn't exist, I could imagine a better being, namely one that did exist.
Hmm.
There's a kind of the same urgency my daughter feels in saying like I want unicorns and fairies to be real in this world and not just real in imaginary worlds or other worlds is the same urgency you might feel about saying that well a being who's that than which nothing greater can be conceived except existence is not a being than which nothing greater can be conceived.
Right.
Yeah.
Is that a persuasive argument?
No.
Why not?
Zero people have ever been persuaded by
It's true.
it. Because you think, well, hang on a second. Like what? No. Because in a sense, it's circular.
Hmm.
You're defining if you begin asking the question, does God exist? Then to build existence into the definition of God is to beg the question.
Hmm.
But I think that objection doesn't have many teeth because I think the idea of a necessary being is not incoherent. That is to say, it's read meaningful to think there might be a being who has being that is of such a sort that must exist. That's not a logical contradiction. And with that being the case, then in the case of that being, you would define being as part of its essence, and it would be defined as having to exist. It would be circular, but not viciously circular.
Yeah.
So, but I think that I start with that objection because I think that gets at some of what we feel like is the cheat that's going on when we first hear the argument, is that you feel like the setup is somehow skipping the process of inquiry and going right to the punchline as part of the frame of the thing, and that feels cheap to us, right?
And that
So,
was one of the objections, I think, even in Anselm's own life, right?
yeah,
I think one of the contemporaries of his, I forgot the name, but isn't it the perfect island? Like I could conceive of a perfect island that, and
yeah,
so it must exist because I can
yeah,
conceive of it. And
yeah, that's
um,
Guanilo.
yeah, yeah, exactly,
Mhm.
exactly. And so then, yeah, Anselm's response is, well, yeah, but the island's not necessary in the way that God is necessary. And so that's the distinction he makes is kind of the uniqueness of God or that uniquely necessary
Yeah,
existence.
yeah.
Um,
So I want to question a different part of it. I want to question a couple different parts of it. I'll start with this one. The bit where when the fool says there is no God, he has something he means in his mind by God.
hmm,
It's not clear to me that that's true. And let me give an example. So when I say there's no such thing as leprechauns, I have in mind something that I mean by leprechauns. I'm denying the existence of something that has properties that I can describe, right? When I say there's no such thing as a round square, I don't have anything in mind. A round square is a self-contradictory concept. It's impossible, right? A point made, a figure made of four right angles where every point is equidistant from the center is you haven't understood what some of those words mean if you think those can be put together correctly. Philosophers would say it's nonsense. It's no lack of God to be not be able to create a round square because a round square doesn't reference anything. It's just putting words together as mush. So I can say there's no such thing as a round square and not have a concept in mind of what round square is. Um, now at that point, much turns on what you mean by concept. I can't envision anything, but I have definitions in mind. I have a definition for round and a definition for square. And what I'm denying is the conjunction of those two definitions. And so Anselm will say, so what is the fool denying? What does he have in mind that he's denying? It may be that what he's denying is that there is, um, it is meaningful to say that there is any being that must exist.
hmm,
That any being has a relationship with being such that being is defined to be part of its being, such that if it can be thought, it must exist. Right. Um, you might ask, well, what if there were no thinkers? What if there had never been any thinkers? Um, would God still exist? And I think that underscores another one of the things that we feel might be sneaky about this argument is that we feel like it might be inverting the ontological and the epistemological order.
Hmm.
Because we're starting from what I can think, that than which nothing greater can be thought. Um, and then saying from the basis of what's true in the order of thinking, we can conclude to what must be true in the order of reality. Um, that feels sneaky. It feels like you're arguing the wrong direction.
Hmm.
Right. I think that, this is where I think you really have to turn to where we started, which is if it's meant to be a logical demonstration that where the conclusion follows necessarily from the premises, there's might be something to complain about here. But if it's taken to be a if it's an argument about understanding how that which is believed is true, finding evidence for that which is believed, then this type of epistemological argument, which lands you in a probable conclusion rather than a necessary conclusion, is perfectly serviceable.
Hmm.
Like that's actually very good.
That kind of reminds me of, I think Aquinas is sort of, I don't know if it's really a direct rebuttal, but he does, I think, make the argument that God's existence really isn't evident to the human mind
Hmm.
in that we can't know God directly.
Hmm.
Um, and so there is no way to really reason his existence a priori. You have to engage in like the five ways, you know. So it's like,
Hmm.
oh, I notice that there's all this motion in the world, and so if I trace that motion back, eventually I get to some kind of necessary first mover type
Hmm.
thing, but it's not really you can't just deduce that God is real just
Yeah,
kind of through sheer exertion.
that's right, because you're arguing from effect to cause.
Yeah,
And arguments from effect to cause are only as good as the um, extent to which we understand all the types of things that could be causes,
right.
right? So let's take that first of Aquinas as far or that Aquinas that way that you talked about in the beginning of the Summa, the arguing from the existence of motion to the likelihood of a first mover. You might say, I can't imagine anything else. No one can imagine anything else that could account for motion except for a first mover who himself must be unmoved, or we get to an infinite regress. But that doesn't mean that there isn't anything else that account for motion necessarily. Just because we can't conceive of it doesn't prove that there isn't something else. And so that argument doesn't issue in a necessary conclusion, it issues in a probable conclusion, right? That if our grasp of causality is correct, then the only thing that can account for this is a first mover. But there's always that bit of space of, but we may not have seen all the types of causality there are yet. How does one angel act on another angel? That might be a form of causality we've never seen. And in that case, we can't conclusively say that this is, has to be this way. This is ultimately the problem with all arguments for the existence of God, is that you're having to argue from effect to cause.
Hmm.
I like to point out to folks, one of the famous arguments is the argument from design, which is usually also called the watchmaker argument. Let's say you're traveling through the Sahara Desert because of a series of life choices that were deeply unfortunate and regrettable, and you find let's say you find an iPhone in the desert, right? Now, maybe it's the case that over millions of years of particles of sand being blown around, they were configured in just this way, and the sun beat on them to turn them into glass, and all of the by a million improbable circumstances, an iPhone came about naturally in the world. But no reasonable person would conclude that. The reasonable person would say someone has been here and has dropped his iPhone. Right. And I think that there's no challenging that is the reasonable conclusion there because it's probably infinitesimally improbable. I'm going to say infinitely improbable that this is the result of a series of random accidents. But the kicker is, as long as the probability of it coming about by a series of random accidents isn't absolutely zero, even if there's only an infinitesimal chance, You could never know from the fact of the phone that you aren't looking at the most likely thing in all of reality,
Hmm.
right? You don't know what world you're living. Are you living in the world where an iPhone spontaneously came into existence by the regular processes of nature? Or are you living in a world where some dude dropped his iPhone? You don't know on arguing from effect to cause. And so for arguments for the divine to work, you would have to know that nothing other than the cause you're imputing this to could ever be the cause of that thing. And that's not really how human knowledge works. We know what we know. We don't know what we don't know.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I think one of my favorite criticisms of this argument is the one from Hegel, which
Mm,
is that there is no way to reason about something without, especially a sort of existential claim, without experiencing it in some way.
mm,
Like we couldn't really talk. You and I could not sit here and do a podcast about beauty if we had never seen a beautiful painting, heard beautiful music, met a beautiful person.
hmm
It wouldn't make sense to us, right? Yeah, there's something that happens in the experience first, which then we can then talk about that experience and we can sort of make abstractions from those experiences,
mm,
which I'll give a shout out. There's a theologian named Jordan Daniel Wood who wrote a really good Substack post called Hegel as Alexandrian Christian.
mm.
Um, there's a kind of mysticism, right, in that only in the encounter with God can then we begin to reason about who God is. But that kind of ties back, I think, to Aquinas's argument, right? Which is that we can't just do this,
Yeah.
a priori. It has to be something we do in response to God's initiative. To be fair, I don't think Anselm is necessarily. I don't know that he would disagree with that. I mean, he's clearly operating from a world in which God's initiative is kind of taken for granted, you know. So it's
Yeah.
not like he's doing this in a vacuum.
That's right.
He's clearly formed and shaped by the scriptures, by the teachings of the church, and all these kind of things. So it's not. I don't think that's really what Anselm's trying to do. But I appreciate that response
hmm
from those guys. So
Yeah. I would, if Hegel's an Alexandrian Christian, it's a shame that he's also a modalist.
that's true. That's true.
Yeah, that's right, and that's really could be seen as another way of stating that Hegel taken to be joining the side of yeah, this is faith seeking understanding. Anselm has had that experience of God. That's called faith, and out of that faith, he has then gone on to reason this way. So
Hmm.
that very well could be the case. It's just another instance of faith seeking understanding, which I think is the best way to think about it. I think all of these logical problems all come from trying to make it into a hard and fast, deductive, necessary proof.
So if it's not an
Yeah.
apologetic argument that's going to go convince people who aren't Christians to become Christians, what is the utility of what Anselm's doing here?
I think the utility of it can be discerned from the direction of the text after the ontological argument is completed. Right.
Hmm.
Once he finishes, it can be instructive even just looking at the titles of chapters. A lot of times medieval works, guys, will give you the author will give you the titles of the chapters up front, and that's really helpful. And you should read those before you read the work because you get a sense of the whole before you get into it, and that's what he wants you to be able to do. So, chapter 2 is that God truly exists. Chapter 3, God cannot be thought not to exist, and so on and so forth. But then we get to chapter 6, how he, God, is perceptive even though he is not a body, how he is omnipotent although he cannot do many things, how he is both merciful and impassible, how the all just and supremely just one spares the wicked and justly has mercy on the wicked, how he justly punishes and justly spares the wicked, and so on and so forth. What this leads to naturally is deeper reflection on the nature of God and how God, to say what to borrow from Dante, how he binds together in one volume things that we see dispersed throughout the rest of reality. He holds together these things that seem like opposites, and he proves in himself that they were never opposites. This is where Hegel's not right about this, right? It's not that he overcomes the opposites in a higher synthesis, it's that he shows that they were never contradictions, they were only paradoxes. A paradox is a seeming contradiction, and whenever you hit a seeming contradiction, you look underneath the appearance to find the truth of the matter, which is an underlying unity, and God reveals that. So I think that for Anselm, the utility, and also therefore for us, the utility of this work is not that it will convince you to believe in God if you don't believe in God, but it becomes a doorway into understanding the vision of God that lies at the heart of classical theism, which is something a lot of people these days have trouble seeing well.
Um, can I've long wrestled with something about this argument, and I'm curious to hear your pushback on it based on because Anselm he does take the ontological argument from just proving that God exists to proving who God is that exists. So,
Yeah.
for example, even in Cur Deus Homo, right at the very end of Cur Deus Homo, if I can find it, he will kind of conclude with a permutation um of the ontological argument. You know, this is a mercy other than which nothing greater can be conceived, or something like that. Is how he
Hmm.
ends the whole treatise. Um,
Hmm.
okay, so it's clear then that when we talk about the ontological argument, we can talk about not only that God exists, but what kind of God exists, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
Uh, if we believe biblically the nature of God is love, um, if we believe that his love is that which wills the salvation of humanity, then could we say that a God who saves X number of people versus a God who saves Y number of people is greater so long as X is greater than Y, which would then sort of lead us to naturally say God has to save all people.
Hmm. Yeah, I don't think that so this is touching on a really important feature, a suite of objections to this argument that I think are really well taken, and this is what I meant at the beginning when I said it depends on your metaphysical commitments, and that is we have to ask what what it is for something to be better, and what types of properties count as better making properties and what don't. Right. So there are many properties in the world, and some of these properties make a thing better and some of them don't. You might say that, you might or might not, but you might say that being rational is better than being irrational. And so rationality is a better making property. I think you wouldn't say that being male is better than being female. And so being male is not a better making property. It's a property that specifies, but it isn't a property that contributes to better or worse on the scale. And so the question about being is A, is being a property at all?
Right.
And if it is a property, is it a better making property? Which they assume from Augustine following Plotinus. It's better to exist than not to exist. I've always had questions about that on the basis of Jesus saying if anyone causes one of these little ones to stumble, it would be better for him if he had never been born.
Hmm.
I don't think the damned do say it's better to exist than not to exist. That's another question. And then also the question of how do we define better? If we define better differently, must God be something else? And does existence continue to be on that map of betterment? So it's kind of the same thing here. How do we define better making properties? Is having had mercy on X number of sinners a better making property? And is it the type of better making property that makes better the more quantitatively you extend it? So having had mercy on X plus one sinners is better than having had mercies of X sinners, and therefore the person who has had mercy on X plus one sinners is better than the person who's had mercy on X sinners. Right. I think the problem with concluding to that is that it is, and this is also my problem with saying that I would disagree with the first premise you said, which is that biblically we know the nature of God is love. I would adjust that to biblically we know that love belongs to the nature of God.
Hmm.
I don't think that you make an equivalence where God is love doesn't mean like Junius is human, God is love. I don't think it's that type of statement. I think it's
Interesting.
more like Junius is mean, God is love. It's more of a property than an essence term.
Hmm.
God is love, but that's not all God is. And if God is love, but also just, but also merciful, but also good, but also it's all these other things, then the best state for God is not necessarily maxing out one aspect of one of his properties, but has to be looked at in the proper hierarchical relationship of all of those properties to one another.
Interesting.
But wait, there's more. Act now, and I'll throw in a shiny new bike. He's unconvinced, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, a little bit, a little bit. Um,
What I love about when Anselm says something that I think is really, really helpful to people in Cur Homo.
hmm,
When Bozo is asking a similar question, he's saying, you know, if God is all merciful, he says to Anselm, why can't this be true? Why can't this syllogism work? Um, God is all merciful. God is all powerful. Therefore, nothing could stop God from having mercy on whom he wants to have mercy. Therefore, God chooses, to have mercy on all. Why can't that work? And then some says because you can't interpret mercy in a way that puts it in opposition to justice. And what he's saying there is not that justice and mercy never disagree with each other. He's saying justice and mercy aren't actually different things. And until you see that, any opposition you're seeing is proof that you haven't understood the concept yet, right? So a love that would save all without regard to the question of justice not only wouldn't be divine love, it actually wouldn't be love at all. And so we need to go back to the drawing board and rethink what the duties of love are. And then Anselm could allege, listen, you're a dad, you love your kids, but you punish them, don't you? You do lots of things that they don't like. But nevertheless you do it out of love, not contrary to love, because and they may say to you, if you loved me, you wouldn't do this to me. And to which you could rightly respond, no, because I love you, I do this to you. And it's their understanding of love that has to be adjusted.
I suppose the analogy breaks down in that my punishment is always aimed at their actual salvation.
That's right. Yeah, that's where the analogy breaks down. But
Or
there's a
or it
sense in
doesn't
which,
break down, or it doesn't break down, right? I mean, that would be, I guess, the point underlying the question that
yeah,
somehow this doesn't contradict God's
yeah,
justice, that
that
this is mercy and love
Nazianzen
and justice, you know.
Nazianzen can help with that, right? When he
Yeah.
says that the reason that he says all of God's judgments are also mercies. So, for example, the reason why the punishment for sin is death is so that the sinner can't go on making himself worse to all eternity.
Mhm.
It puts a terminus to his sin so that this far and no further. And even though that doesn't issue in the salvation of the sinner, that is a good thing done for the sinner. It keeps you from going as bad as you could be, right?
That's right.
And you could say that about judgment because it's not just a matter of you know love is about how I feel towards you, but it doesn't automatically reshape the world according to my feelings and desires, right? I've loved many people who have not loved me back. And that has so I'd like to see the world configured a certain way with regard to my life. And I'm trying to love the world into that configuration, and I can't do it because my love doesn't have the power to coerce the love of the other, right?
Mhm.
God's love, so far as we can tell, and this is a bit controversial, it depends on the type of theologian you are, but God's love, under the way I would see it, God has chosen not to be the kind of love that could compel return love.
Yeah.
And so that means that loving you perfectly doesn't prove that you will love him back. Loving you perfectly doesn't prove you'll love him back, which means that what does justice look like in a situation where what you want and what I want don't agree? In the case of my relationships, it means I have to let that other person go. To the extent that I try to cling to them, in spite of the fact that they don't want to love me back, I have done harm to themselves and to me, and maybe to other people, friends along the way, and that sort of a thing. To the extent that I let them go, that love can even be something pleasant to look back on, even though it wasn't requited, because it was allowed to have it reached the end of its scope, all it could do, and it didn't try to go further. It allowed itself to break against that limit and recede. Right. Which is another way of saying, and this is a continuation of the same response, which is that bringing all of the divine attributes on the table at the same time keeps us from taking a one human conception of love and then divinizing that and applying that backwards to God. Knowing that God is these other things can help us to correct ways in which our understanding of love doesn't necessarily include justice. And so we can go to town, but knowing that God has to include justice is a way of helping us to recognize where we're bringing cultural blind spots to understanding what these big words mean.
Yes, but maybe not. But I feel like this is beside the point, and so I we should probably get back to the
Well,
text
and I
more
would
than
say that
this
what's
because
good
I
about
think
this, I think it's analogous to the point, right?
yeah,
Because I think that's the question. If we wanted to really keep plugging away at, yeah, but does it hold together philosophically? These are the kind of discussions we have to have about being and better and thinking and all of that kind of a thing, right?
sure, sure.
Is it better for to exist in real things than in thought? I think a lot of people today are not convinced that it is. It's not as wide uniformly believed that it was as it was at Anselm's time. And if you happen to not believe that, then the argument is done from the beginning,
Mm,
right?
mhm.
Is there one best way for things to be? Anselm's time, they thought that. There were all these there's one best state of affairs, and God's going to exemplify that. And a lot of times, and Anselm himself plays with this idea, and I think largely comes down in favor of it. There's a sense that there's one best state of affairs for all of reality, and God's going to bring that about.
Mhm.
And that leads you to the idea of Leibniz, this is the best of all possible worlds.
Right.
Um, I'm not sure. I'm quite sure that there's not one that omniscience doesn't know one best state of affairs. It knows perhaps infinitely many equally best states of affairs from which it is free to choose. In the same way that, like, I don't have one best friend, I have multiple best friends because I consider best friend not to be a hierarchizing of my friends so that one guy stand comes out on top of all the rest of them, but rather to be a top tier. And these guys, I don't need to rank these guys. I know any one of them would go to the mat for me. I know any one of them would take a bullet for me. I would do the same for them. That's what it means to be the best friend. I kind of feel like for a divine being, there's a top tier of states of affairs. And if that's the case, then it's hard to say, well, the being than which no greater can be thought would have to look precisely like this.
Hmm. Yeah. Very interesting. So then, let's see. How should I frame this? So I guess, certainly there's a sense in which this does reflect Anselm's view of the cosmos of God. But there is a sense in which he seems to be appropriating this argument in the form of a prayer,
Hmm.
which, as we mentioned earlier, I mean, that's the argument Bart makes, but that's been picked up by many other people. What do you think the significance of the argument is in the fact that it's ensconced in that mode of
Hmm.
prayer? He often addresses God directly throughout the treatise. You, where to find you, Lord?
Hmm.
If you are not present here, where, since you are absent, shall I look for you? I mean, this whole thing is about is a direct conversation with God.
Yeah.
So why does he frame it that way?
And even the name of it, right? Proslogion, which he translates into Latin as a locutio, which is ad locutio, speaking to
Hmm.
someone. And so the name of it is I'm talking to God, right? And it's interesting that the monologion, which one person speaking, is when you're seeking within yourself, and the proslogion is when you're addressing God directly. I'll also point out that this, I mean, I get major confessions vibes off of this, right? Because Augustine's confession is the same sort of prayer directed to God. And he starts with Augustine starts the Confessions with these kinds of theological speculations about the nature of God, and at several important moments in the Confessions, he veers off into how are you related to God to time, O Lord? How is it that you are present and yet I don't sense you, and all these other sorts of things, some of which Anselm directly picks up on in his opening as well. So it's a part of a genre thingy there. I think it's got to be this, right? My sense is that this is it's a prayer because he is turning towards something that already exists in his mind, right? And so there's not in some sense the fool bit is a red herring. Oh, well, what does the fool think when he says there is no God, right? Like how does that even has even everything to think? But it's all very hypothetical because Anselm starts with the idea and the experience of God in his heart, and he's speaking out of that. And so I think the important part about that is that um, it's there's a submission and an obedience that is at play before the intellectual process gets going. Anselm says, I'm going to think in obedience to the idea and reality of you, rather than I'm going to think in an untethered way, like Descartes tried to do. And I think that in a nutshell could be the entire difference between the medieval and the modern projects. Modernism tries to think in an untethered way so that it doesn't prejudice the conclusion, but medieval thought is obedient and subordinate to um, a reality that it feels conditions all of thought and is the condition of the possibility of any thought. And I think that's probably the strongest. I do think that is the strongest evidence that what's happening here is not a proof for the existence of God in the traditional sense. Right. He's already thinking in obedience to God. And so he's not looking to prove that God exists. He's looking for evidence that God exists so that he can be more confident in what he already believes, and I would say knows to be true.
Yes. I think I would maybe go even a little further.
No.
Yeah. Um, so I think one way to help frame this is Martin Buber's I thou versus I it, right? So
Mm,
Anselm is not talking about God as an it, as a thing to
hmm
be dissected, as a thing to be scientifically known,
hmm
at least in our modern scientific way of knowing.
Yeah.
But rather he's encountering God
Yeah.
in a rather direct way,
hmm
which is the very beginning of the text, right? I mean, the first section of Proslogion is a rousing of the mind to the contemplation of God. It's an invitation to escape. It's an invitation into something bigger than oneself.
mm,
So we begin with that, but in that way of thinking, in that way of praying, really, there are aspects both of negative and positive theology going on, right?
hmm
There is, because God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. The moment that I have a kind of stable definition or image of God, He's big enough that it's that image will never do. I can
Yeah.
never make that a final thing. So there's a sense in
Yeah.
which then all of my theology will always only ever be tentative, right?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
never complete because there's always more to do. And
Yeah.
as soon as I think I'm complete, I've lapsed into a kind of idolatry. At the same time, we're not stuck in a kind of cycle of negative theology where we can never say anything about God, because clearly chapters 5 through 23 are all about God's nature and his attributes. He's
hmm
unity, he's simplicity, he's eternal, he's omnipresent, he's omnipotent, he's omniscient, he's good, he's just, he's merciful. I mean, all those things have to be true about God based on that definition. The problem is, like you said, I mean, there is that problem of transposing our human understanding of one of these attributes and all of the cultural blind spots that we have and all those, and projecting them onto God. That's certainly something that we can do, but we can affirm all those things about
Yeah.
God. So there is
Right.
both a unity of negative and positive theology. And I think by ensconcing it in a prayer, Anselm is also then recognizing that as he's doing the work of theology, there is a recognition of his own creaturehood, his
Mm,
own limits.
hmm
God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived, and there is a separation then between what exists here and who I'm actually talking about.
Yeah.
And that divide is quite stark and is really important. Perhaps it goes back all the way to Genesis 1:1. I mean, God created the heavens and the earth. God, heavens and the earth. There is a stark distinction between those two things. God's not
Yeah.
part of the heavens and the earth. The heavens and earth aren't really part of God in a metaphysical sense. They're a
Yeah.
creation of his, but they're not part of him,
Yeah.
in a sort of pantheistic way. And so Anselm, I think, is in approaching it as a prayer, kind of recognizing that. And so ultimately, I'd say it's kind of a two-edged sword in that on the one hand, it is an argument against idolatry.
Mm,
That is where we make God a box and say, you have to live here in whatever, mental conception I have trapped you in. Um, while also recognizing that to break the idolatrous conceptions of God that humans have often held in various cultures in various ways. I mean, even within the Christian tradition, we have had our own ways of doing that. Um,
hmm
this is a ground for a mystical experience that draws us into contemplation.
Yeah.
This is something that pulls us further up and further into the mystery of God. And
Yeah.
so I think it's kind of a both and there, and that it's a warning against a kind of ossified view of God or a static view of God, but it's also an invitation to something much bigger,
Yeah.
and something that has to keep going. We have to go further up and further into that mystery always.
That's so good. I think that's a good place to leave
Okay. Wow. Okay. Well, maybe I'll get you on the other point then later at another time.
it.
Good. Excellent. Well, yeah, it is such a good text, and it's short too. That's the
Yeah.
other thing, listeners. It's only 20 pages, but it's one of those things you could sit with for a very long time and come back to and see new things every time you read it, and I think
Yeah.
it's quite beautiful.
Yeah, and I would say as you read it, don't the next time you read it, don't read it to figure out if you can defeat his argument or to assess the quality of his argument or anything like that. Read it as a prayer.
Mhm.
Read it as a way of spending time with God and contemplating and reflecting on these things, because that's how he means you to read it. And then just see if anything different comes out of that reading. You can always go back to reading it the other way later. There's nothing stopping you from reverting to that. But different things may strike you about what he's doing here when you read it that way.
Yes. It's also a good reminder, I think, at least in the classical tradition, that theology is a kind of prayer.
Yeah.
I think we think of it often as an intellectual exercise.
Hmm.
Um, but Aquinas defines prayer as lifting the mind to God. And so if we're actually doing that, then we're doing some form of prayer. And so the things aren't exclusive, quite the opposite. Theology is done by people of prayer, and people of prayer are doing theology.
Yeah.
And so that brings a kind of dignity, I think, to a simple faith, a person who shows up to church and says their prayers in the pews and receives the sacrament and all that. I mean, they're doing theology. They're
Yep.
living it. They maybe don't think about it and using complicated words and stuff, but that's what they're doing.
Hmm.
And a theologian should be a person who's praying.
Yep.
So Anselm doesn't let us off the hook. We have to actually believe.
And that's a wonderful segue to my endnote.
Oh, what is your end note?
My end note is there's a little book, I think Penguin did it. Yep, it's a Penguin, called The Prayers and Meditations of St. Anselm. And so they've just gathered together a lot of different prayers and things like that he's given. And it's a chance to dive into the spirituality of the man behind all of this rigorous philosophical theology. And I think it's the most delightful parts of Anselm, and I highly recommend it.
Those prayers are so beautiful. He
Yes.
is a true theologian of the cross in those prayers in a way that
Hmm.
maybe you don't quite get in a proslogion. Not that he avoids it, but it's just not really what he's doing here. But
Yeah.
Cordeus Homo is definitely maybe the more intellectual version of that. But the prayers, it really takes on a new dimension. And
Yeah.
I love those prayers. His prayers to the Blessed Virgin Mary are wonderful. His prayers to the cross
Hmm.
is so good. I love all those.
Yeah.
Um, Okay, mine, I think I have to do two based on how the conversation went. So the first is, they're both articles. The first is an article called A Gift Exceeding Every Debt by David Bentley Hart. David Bentley Hart is an Orthodox theologian and philosopher, and he is defending Anselm from some of the criticisms that have been leveraged against him by Eastern Orthodox theologians who think his atonement theology is too legalistic, too transactional, too kind of anti-Trinitarian, that it might turn the Father and the Son against each other or whatever. And Hart, I think, does a really good job of showing that there are many parallels between what Anselm is trying to do in Hers Cordeus Homo and what St. Athanasius did in his much earlier work on the Incarnation. There are, of course, distinctions. They're not exactly doing the same thing, but the core of what they're arguing for is very similar. And so Hart's defense of Anselm in that article was really instrumental in my shift in understanding Anselm better and appreciating him a lot more. Now, the other article is much more fun, I'd say. It's called Anselmian Apocatastasis, The Fitting Necessity of Universal Salvation and St. Anselm's Curdeus Homo by Roberto de la Naval. He's at Notre Dame. And the article is quite interesting. He kind of makes the argument I was trying to make earlier, or at least posed earlier, about how if you really read Curdeus Homo to its kind of fullest extent, you kind of come away with the idea that, yeah, maybe there's hope that that actually everyone will be saved in the end. It's a very interesting argument. He acknowledges at the beginning, of course, Anselm doesn't believe this.
Hmm.
But it is a kind of playful way of reading Anselm that's at least very thought-provoking. And so if you want to go further with Anselm, read his prayers, read Curdeus Homo, but then read those two articles, and I think you'd have a lot to think about and discuss for sure.
Nice. Very nice.
Excellent. Well, this is great. We now are caught up. This is the first episode of season 4, by the way. I don't think we made a big enough deal about that at the beginning of the episode, but this is it. We're starting our fourth season. We're so thankful to all of our listeners who have stuck with us this long. It's been really awesome to get to know those who are participating in our Substack community, commenting on episodes, interacting in the chat, contacting us by email. We're always happy to hear from you all about stuff like that. Our next episode for November of 2025 is going to be Billy Budd Sailor by Herman Melville, which is a fantastic book. It's a short read as well, but it's really, really interesting. And so I'm excited to talk about that with you, Junius.
Yeah, me too.
Awesome. Well, listeners, in the meantime, keep reading.